both some of the Institute's influence indirectly for other folks, and then where those folks would like to see us go into the future. And so I invited 4 friends to reflect. Well, of course, I mean, we have a very large network of friends, but to both reflect on the ways that the Institute's work has shaped what they do, and then also what they would like us to do or would like to see come out of the Institute into the future. And I've asked Gordon Mikoski and Cheryl Gilkes and Michael Piazza and, oh my God, thank you, Edwin Aponte. I can't even see that far now these days. But I'm not dead yet. I'm not dead yet. And I will let each of them introduce themselves and then address those questions in a few minutes, and then we'll go back to a conversation, okay?
Okay, I'm Gordon Mikoski. I teach Christian education in the Practical Theology Department at Princeton Theological Seminary. I also edit Theology Today, and I serve on the advisory board for EPIC. Also, my daughter is one of the researchers. Yay. So the 2 questions. One, how has the Institute impacted my work? And then what do I see as the future? First, I'm not a sociologist of religion or of anything. I'm a practical theologian, so I'm kind of an interloper, but I'm always learning. And I'm actually doing qualitative empirical research on a Lilly grant related to congregations. And that work, qualitatively, connects to what's going on with the Institute, because that gives me the Institute's research gives me a much larger framework to sort of contextualize and locate the things that I'm finding in local, very specific places. Also, I just really appreciate what the Institute has done for decades to provide solid empirical research, and many of the books that were held up earlier I assign in my classes, and they inform my thinking. And because I came at this from a theological point of view, and I'm sort of migrating by stages into more empirical things, but actually integrating the normative and the descriptive. As a practical theologian, I want to bring those things together, but also ask the question, what should we do with this information? How should we use it? So it's a catalyst for rethinking. In particular, it's a catalyst for my thinking about ecclesiology. And it's no longer effective for me just to sort of open Calvin or the church dogmatics and say, well, the church is with a big capital C, like it's one thing. It's actually, there's a lot of churches and it's a lot of things, and we have to rethink what church means from below as well as from above. So that's just the beginning. I also point my students to the website and to the research and so on. Future impact. I've become convinced that all theology is contextual. And so that means several different things. One, all theology comes from a context. Also, theology means things in a certain context, and it means different things in different places. So the work, I think, here has to continue because the contexts are changing, as we're hearing. And it helps to give texture and nuance and depth, because one size does not fit all, I would say. Also, I think the work going forward, as it has all along, provides a way to check runaway theological imagination. I'll give you one illustration. And this actually comes from conversation I had with Mark Chaves at Duke, but and I think the evidence that you all have come up with shows that one of the trends in American religious life is congregations that are multicultural and multiracial. The last 20 or 30 years, this has become more and more of a trend. I can't remember the exact number, but it's 22, 24% or something. It's significant. And so in my theological mind, I'm thinking, wow, we're all going to move, in my progressive thinking, towards Revelation 7, where every nation and culture, and we're all going to be gathered there. And Mark Chaves said, well, actually, the data doesn't show that. Because there's a certain threshold It's like 80-20 or something like that. And when the dominant group starts to feel like their group is shrinking beyond, 80%, they start going somewhere where it's more homogenous. So that kind of checked my theological imagination. There's a lot of other examples where the data, the facts on the ground, actually chase in and help me to rethink theological kinds of things. I could say that about the rise of the nuns too. My wife, who's here, she has in her congregation the former president of the Gallup poll, who's not at all convinced by the rise of the nuns as a new phenomenon. What he thinks is new is, this is Frank Newport, that people feel more comfortable to say what has already been the case all along, that they don't actually believe. Mm-hmm. It's more socially acceptable. So it's interesting, and it raises questions sometimes the empirical work. But this is what I'm so grateful for with the Hartford Institute, Research Institute doing, is pointing to trends, but then asking questions. And I liked what was said earlier, don't draw conclusions just yet. Keep thinking, because it's not always what you think the answer is or what the cause is. I think I would just leave it with saying that in the future, as a practical theologian, I need the work of the Hartford Institute. I can't just open the Bible and interrogate my tradition and try to come up with things like, what is pastoral ministry, or what does leadership in church look like? What is church? What should a religious community's involvement with a community be? I can't answer those questions apart from solid empirical research. This is an impetus for me, the research that comes, to think creatively and to reimagine very basic things about what it means to be a religious believer and to engage in practices. So I'll leave it at that.
Good afternoon. The last time I was asked to introduce myself, poor Scott, he didn't know what he was getting himself into. The person who had invited me to speak had lost my CV, and they said, you'll have to introduce yourself. And the first thing I said to people is, there are two of me. And there are two of me. One is what I just told was 99 days into being the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Professor of African American Studies and Sociology Emerita at Colby College in Waterville, Maine. And the other of me is assistant pastor for special projects at the Union Baptist Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which means I drive a lot and listen to a lot of books on CD. But my point is, I was a secular sociologist who blundered into religious studies. And Hartford Institute of Religion Research became a space where the conversation about religion, and not just social change and social structure. I started doing some work on something called the Sanctified Church, and it was more to answer questions that were raised by William Julius Wilson in his book, Power, Racism, and Privilege. What happens to black communities historically when there is a major cataclysmic change? How do they reorganize? And my question was, why did people at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, have to create new churches? And it involved asking a number of questions both within my family and outside of it. And in the process, I also was going through spiritual changes in my own life that led to my becoming an ordained Baptist minister and going to seminary at the same time that I was on tenure track at a wannabe Category 1 research institution. So when I say there are two of me, I publish both secular sociology because we come from a discipline, and Nancy, you and I know this, that until a few years ago treated religion as some epiphenomenal human event that they hoped would go away. That's the only way to, because especially the progressive Marxist folks, I had a paper that I sent off to, I won't name the journal or the editor, who by the way, later apologized to me, and I learned the process of how you can get discriminated against in the publishing process. But I sent the article in for review. The person sent it out to 4 reviewers. The reviewers threw it on the floor and jumped up and down on it, rubbed their feet on it, and said, no, do not publish. And one of them went to the Xerox machine and Xeroxed what Karl Marx had to say about religions being the opiate of the people. And clearly I had not passed Classical Theory 101. And, you know, I was in shock. My advisors were in shock. They were like, how did this happen? And in the meantime, at this Category 1 wannabe 1 research institution, I happened to meet James Cone of Black theology fame, and I said to him, in the meantime, I had sent the paper to another sociologist with all of the reviewers' comments, you know, how, you know, to get. And I said to him, I have this paper, would you be willing to read it? And he read it, he sent me a note and said, send it to the Journal for the Interdenominational Theological Center. Remember, sociology, theology. They sent it out to 4 reviewers, and it came back, publish, 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 no revisions, no revisions, no revisions, no revisions. And I just, in the process of getting ready to remember my good friend Dolores Williams, a theologian, who I found the handwritten note from the editor apologizing because he forgot to tell me that the paper was accepted, and I discovered the paper was accepted when I got copies of the journal. So when I say, when I say there are 2 of me, that is what has happened. And what HIRR did was they provided the NERDs, the New England Research Discussion Group, and one of my projects on which I'm working now got a very helpful hearing in that space, and it is my project on the role of African Muslims in shaping African American Christianity during slavery. And I have at least published 1 article on it, so I tell people, if I drop dead tomorrow, I'm at least in the literature. So that's who I am. And so how has the Hartford Institute for Religious Research helped? They've helped to provide a space for sociologists to engage both religious studies, to hear the voices of the various denominational audiences, and in my case, to explore the African American religious experience, having worked with Thomas Hoyt, who again was one of the early people here. When I saw the K-Pro computer out there, that was the first time I had seen a computer, was when he showed me his K-Pro computer in this building. It was just, you know, and he, at my ordination, did the charge to the scholar. So this space has all sorts of special places for me and has connected me with people, and Nancy and others helped me to develop a research project and get it funded, and so I can't say enough wonderful things. The 2 of me are very happy. Keep doing what you're doing.
I'm Michael Piazza, and I guess I'm the practitioner up here. I actually am just a pastor. So
You ain't nobody, you're just a pastor.
I'm just a pastor. So I just sort of want, that's the part of me that I want to speak from anyway. I actually I've written my sermon for Sunday, so, you know, I am the person who has to figure this out week after week. And I've been figuring it out week after week for a long, long time. I said to Joel, next year is my 50th anniversary in pastoral ministry. I literally, it just means I'm old.
So we don't have 50 years in the pulpit.
Well, I started when I was 18 years old. I literally was 18 years old, and the United Methodist Church was in desperate need of preachers. So they licensed me to preach, and I've been doing it ever since. And that's sort of who I am, and who I am in terms of my relationship with the Institute. So I was a Methodist minister in South Georgia and worked my way through college and seminary at Candler School of Theology in Emory by pastoring Methodist churches. And during my seminary education, I decided that it wasn't any way that you could pastor churches and be dishonest about who you are. And so I came out, which in the Methodist Church, particularly in South Georgia, that was the end of my career. Fortunately, though, I went from being at a Methodist church near Emory to the Metropolitan Community Church, just a few blocks away, from literally from one Sunday to the next, and so it was a good gift. And it was there at the Metropolitan Community Church, which was a congregation of almost entirely LGBTQ people, that I met Scott, who was you were finishing your PhD at. Okay, you're a master. So that's when we met, and he wrote a book about gays and religion, which to me is still one of the most amazing things that a scholar of his stature has that on his resume. And we often talk about drag shows and drag church in Atlanta, Georgia. So that's how I first made my connection there. Fast forward a few years, and I ended up going I ended up in Jacksonville, Florida, at a church that was mostly LGBTQ as well, and it was firebombed like 3 times. And so that was sort of a learning curve there for me. But what I discovered was that that the church could still grow. And so all through my Methodist time and through this church growing, it just sort of like, I assumed that new pastors come to a church and a church grows. I didn't know any better because I was a kid. That's the way it happened. And so then I went from Jacksonville, Florida to Dallas, Texas in 1987. And I became the pastor of the Metropolitan Community Church of Dallas in 1987. That church is sort of interesting in that it had 180 members when I went there in November, All Saints Sunday of 1987. And in January of 1988, I did 18 funerals for young men who've died of AIDS. So, it wasn't 10% of the congregation because they weren't all members. But during my tenure there, we did over 1,500 funerals. And that church suddenly exploded in growth. And again, why I didn't know, but it just started growing, and it grew, 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 and it grew. And I hated Dallas. Like for 22 years, I hated Dallas. The entire time I was there, I hated Dallas, but I could never leave because the church just kept growing. And it was during the time this church finally got to a space where it was literally a mega church. And again, Scott and I reconnected because it was the largest LGBTQ church in the world, called the Cathedral of Hope today. And literally sort of at its apex before I left, we would have 2,500 people on Sunday morning. We had satellite churches before it was popular in 3 states, and in 6 cities. And I would often preach 3 times on Sunday, once on Saturday night, 3 times on Sunday morning, get on a plane and fly somewhere to preach at one of those churches. 65,000 people watched us online and on television every Sunday. So it was just a phenomenon. And every newspaper in the world, I think, must have come and done a story on us. And they always ask the same question. Why is the world's largest gay and lesbian church in Dallas, Texas, of all places? It was not a user-friendly, I was joking with somebody that, I had to wear literally bulletproof vests under my vestments every Sunday, and we had just filing cabinets full of hate mail. And my assistant, who's been my assistant for 20 years, the very first Sunday he worked for me, had to go look under the pulpit for a bomb because the police had come and searched, but they forgot to search under the pulpit. So it was just that kind of setting, and yet the church kept growing and growing. But the greatest challenge of all during that period was that there was no one to help me. Like, I had never pastored a church. We got to the first 1,000 members, and I looked around and said, what the hell is this? Like, how did this happen? And what do I do now? And literally no one to help. I found help, but I found it actually in 3 sources. Ironically, Robert Schuller at the Crystal Cathedral actually helped us develop a television ministry. And Lyle Schaller, God rest his soul, just became a mentor to me because Lyle had a gay son who his son and I knew one another because he was a publisher. And so Lyle, just every time I had a question, I'd call him up and he'd send me a little yellow index card with a scribbled note back about it, what his answer was or solution was. And the Hartford Institute. I'd never heard of Hartford Seminary, but the Hartford Institute sending out information that was like, it would just like, oh, wow, this is, and I would take these little, it seems like they were always yellow, I don't know, papers, I don't know, and to the board and say, okay, this is what we need to be doing. Notice these churches are the ones that are doing well, so we need to, and so, Faith Communities Today really was a godsend, and because it was a major source of inspiration and information. And of course, my connection with the current person who really is the salesperson for Hartford Institute, and a person who I like. I'm not sure I respect anybody more than Scott in terms of his just brilliance and how practical his wisdom has been to me. It isn't just the sociology of religion. It really is like how to use this information and how to get what you need to figure it out, and how to do maps and demography and all that sort of stuff that Scott has taught me. And so as a result of that, Scott one day said to me, I was in Atlanta at the time he showed up at church one Sunday morning, a church that actually became a multiracial church. I went there with 23 people, and I went there, and so they said, when the denomination asked me if I would help churches grow, I said, I don't know anything about church growth. This happens. So then I had to figure out what I knew. And so I took this little bitty church in Atlanta that was so small it couldn't afford to pay me. And the one thing, my one goal was that, okay, if this church is going to grow, it needs to grow in the way that the church ought to be. So every Sunday morning, I don't think I've ever told this story publicly. Every Sunday morning, I would get up at my home, and I would drive by Martin Luther King's grave and Coretta Scott King's grave and stop just long enough to utter a prayer that this church that I was pastoring would ultimately be the kind of church that Dr. King envisioned and talked about in his beloved community. And so then I'd go on and go to church and preach. And when I left, 5 years later, there were 200-something people, and it was 60-40, black to white, gay and straight, Asian. And there's not even a great Asian population in Atlanta, but it was just amazing. It was an amazing congregation of mostly younger people. Scott came to church there one Sunday and said, you should teach in the D-Min program. And it was like, okay, I will. So for 10 years, I commuted here for 10 years. First from Atlanta, I'd fly up and teach, and then later from New York. And then along the way, he said, oh, wait, you don't have a doctorate. You can't teach. So I taught my way into getting into a doctorate. So that's how I ended up at Hartford Seminary for 10 years. And am so grateful to be a part, just to be connected. I was thinking about this during lunch. It was like, why am I here? Listening to Bill, to the first panel, it's like, those are amazing people who, those folks, their obituaries will be in the New York Times. What am I doing here? And what is great is that you allowed someone like me, who just is a preacher, that's really just what I do, to learn from you and to participate and to contribute. And I think the future, what people like me need, rabbis and imams and pastors and priests, is for Hartford Institute to keep doing exactly what it's doing right now, looking at what's happening in the world today and helping us figure out what to do about it. I said to Joel a minute ago, I have had hundreds. I have a small consulting thing I do on the side. I've had hundreds of churches contact me and say, will you work with us? Because we can't figure this out. I mean, it's just happening to us, and we don't know how to do hybrid church. And it was like, I do, I don't. But when y'all get finished, I will. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Edwin Aponte. Since June 1st, I have been serving as Dean of the Theological School and Professor of Religion and Culture at Drew University. Previously, I was Executive Director of the Louisville Institute for 7 years. So as I mentioned to someone earlier today, I've moved from giving away Lilly money to now asking for Lilly money. And so, the impact of the Hartford Institute of Religion Research, I'll try to be brief. When I felt called, and it was a call to pursue doctoral studies, and I interviewed at Temple University, the Department of Religion, and I shared with the Director of Graduate Studies at the time my very vague vision of studying Hispanic Protestant churches. And he said, well, that's really good, but we don't do that here. And I said to him, well, no one does it anywhere, so give me a chance. And they gave me a chance, and once I got there, I, in lots of ways, didn't know what to do. And a resource for me was the Hartford Institute of Religion Research and the good work here. So I drew on that, and I did field research in Philadelphia, looking at Latino Protestant churches and paying close attention to something that we now call, thanks to Nancy and others, lived religion. What was going on in the congregations, and I'd visit all the denominational congregations that I could, non-denominational, Episcopal, Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist, even Methodist. And I discovered by paying attention that there was something there that it didn't matter what the denomination was. It was how they were practicing their faith, particularly in the songs that they were singing. In Spanish, the corritos, the choruses, the little choruses that were showing up everywhere. And that became part of my dissertation. That became my first published piece. Eventually, to make a longer story short, it got me invited to join the faculty at Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. And I got there just as the faculty had finished revising the curriculum. Those of you who've been on faculty know about that. And they had put in this foundational linchpin course called The Church in Its Social Context. And what they gave me was a course number, course title, course description, and that was it. This is important for our new curriculum, and figure it out. And I wasn't even there as part of the conversation when they created this. So given that freedom, what did I do? I leaned into the work of Hartford Institute. And the way I taught that course, it was a course in congregational studies. And not the only one, but our key textbook was Studying Congregations. And I brought my students through that, particularly since the majority of my students at Perkins were Methodists of various types, including United Methodists. And unless they had a connection, they were going to be moved every 4 years. And so part of it was for them to do that exegesis of context and to apply that all the time. And eventually I moved into academic administration, served as academic dean at 2 other institutions. And one of the things that I learned and have applied and continue to apply is the insights of congregational studies to leadership. I don't know if Hartford Institute intended that, but that's what I did. So every place I went into was to understand what was happening there in the context. And even doing what was the equivalent of the kitchen stories at that particular seminary. And that was so rich to find that out. And to do the interview. I don't know if anyone really caught on what I was doing when I became academic dean at those schools. And that's something I also did when I became executive director of Louisville Institute. The leadership formation that I have received from many of you here through the occasional times I've been blessed to interact with you, but particularly through your writings, through the work of the Hartford Institute, has shaped me as a leader, and I continue to apply this in my new role at theological school. So as looking to the future, I have no crystal ball, so I don't know, but one of the things I would encourage the Hartford Institute to do is to explore more, not only in terms of all this rich research that you're doing and the stuff that was shared today, but also to step back a little bit about the leadership formation role that the Institute plays. It has been so important in my life, and I think in others as well.
Now I sort of do feel dead. Well, thank you all. Just both humbling to hear and also invigorating. I think instead of having a conversation with me, are there questions or comments from the audience? David, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. A couple of quick answers. One, Jim Neiman came up earlier, and he and I worked together to save the Association of Practical Theology. It was almost dead, and we stabilized it and formalized it, and then we were able, because of that, to get a practical theology group at AAR, with the idea that we could have those kinds of conversations, but they still don't quite happen, right? Second comment is, I'm always amazed by colleagues at my school who, in theology or Bible or history even, suddenly discover context and empirical realities, and like as if they're the first ones ever to, do this. And so it's very annoying. But on the other hand, it creates an opening. And I'm thinking of particular colleagues. So I think now, more than ever, in those other disciplines are open to a conversation. And I think this is another reason why the Hartford Institute is so helpful, because of I was writing notes earlier, and I was thinking one of the things that's a real resource is I've met so many interesting people by being connected with Hartford and Epic and FACT and all that. And I think the social networking can make that happen, maybe now in a way that it hadn't been possible before, partly because so many colleagues are discovering practice and context and identity negotiation and so on. A lot of it resonates with empirical research, and I think practical theologians would be more open, but they need to be invited. But that's low-hanging fruit. It's more like the systematic theologians and historians. But I think there's an openness that I haven't seen, 10, 20 years ago.
It also helps when somebody like Gordon gives us a whole issue of the journal to promote the Faith Communities Today findings, and that hadn't been in the journal for decades and decades. So, I think you're also helping to make a platform for some of that. So that's really excellent. Other thoughts, comments, questions, any? Well, yes, yeah.
I'm just going to ask, how does the results and publication of your results get into theological schools? Each of the denominations often have their own theological training program, but how much of outreach, I guess that's really the question I want to ask, or the experience of Hartford Institute over the years, how much have they been able to get into the curriculum and into the teaching of the upcoming ministers of faith and pastors and leadership at the theological seminary stage?
Yeah, not enough from my perspective. Right, but maybe I should ask the folks who have been in seminaries. Yeah, Ed, what?
So when I was teaching, and I did this both at Perkins School of Theology and at Lancaster Theological Seminary, they got it. It was required for them to be interacting with the research here through the books like Studying Congregation, with the newer reports that were coming out, and I built it into the curriculum in required courses. So I didn't have all the students, but those who came through my courses were exposed to it. And so part of it is, I also tried to be a type of Hartford Institute evangelist with my colleagues on the faculty. And some of them, not all of them, started to bring it into the shape of their courses too. Whether or not there can be a command, a fiat from above that this happens on all seminaries, I don't think that's going to happen. But to the degree that we can do this kind of very intentional recruiting of our colleagues who are theological educators, that can happen increasingly, I think.
I think the crisis that we're in is pretty helpful, because it gets people's attention to people in theological schools trying to figure out what's going on and what should we do about that. And if you look at the data, if you read the Chronicle of Higher Education, all of higher education is in crisis. And so there's an openness, and I think the results of the research that the Hartford Institute is producing will speak to the question, what is going on? How do we make sense of it? And so I think the quality of the research will begin to be picked up, probably. But I think giving it a little shove might help too. Right? Schleiermacher made a case for theology to be included in the first modern university, the University of Berlin, because the society at the time was going through massive change and was in crisis. And he made a case that there should be empirical research, because you can't figure out how to provide leadership unless you know what's going on. He made a bunch of other arguments, but that was central.
I just want to follow up on something what Gordon says, and this is me, so this is not, I'm not putting on you. I think Schleiermacher is a good example, but sometimes we miss the point and learn the wrong thing. So in my view, Schleiermacher was responding to his context, and part of that context was a shaping of the curriculum of theological education. And what many of us today, what we have done is locked in the response of Schleiermacher to his context. So we have a curriculum that's good for the early 1800s in Germany, all right? But the learning we should have gotten was what's happening in our own setting, what's the context, and create a curriculum that meets the needs today and as far into the future as we can see.
Yeah, Bill.
Pick up on that. participation. Jack Cheryl and Barbara Wheeler with the Deep Mint program, very important. But also important is producing the next generation of people who understand the discipline as well as the setting of what it means to be a sociologist of religion in the context of a place of queer people. That's a real unnoticed contribution, I think, to this work.
Yeah, very true. Nancy, yeah.
And just to add to this discussion about how we evangelize for this kind of connection, I want to really affirm the kind of work that Scott and his team have been doing recently in actually going to the American Academy of Religion.
Yes.
Which is where, all these seminary faculty,
It's
they
huge.
have to go every year, and where people go to, hire people and whatever. But having a presence for this kind of research in sessions at the AAR is just one little place where we kind of weasel our way into that conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, Erica.
I would say, Gordon, I'm a Christopher Malone. And I would just sort of like amen to, I think it is so critical for this work to be out in our seminaries and our high schools and, people leading churches, leading congregations, this kind of work is so, yes, there is a place for your church history and your New Testament and all of that, but I just think that we miss so much, and so many of us get out into places of leadership and they go, oh my gosh, this is actually what I needed. And so I think it's absolutely critical as we continue to raise up the next generation of leaders in our religious institutions that this kind of work is getting out into those places where people actually have access to learning and studying. And so any way that can happen, I think that's a great way. Going to
Candace, you're taking notes there, right? No, just kidding. Yeah. Yeah. Oh.
I had a question about how the Institute is creating space to build this work, particularly pastors and assistant funding here. I have a conversation among us. What is your vision about broadcasting this to local pastors, and how do you invite them to come to the table to kind of be a part of the conversation? Not only get the information, but that's one thing. To use this, how do they massage this information to be of value?
Yeah, one of the things that I've championed all the time that I've been at the Institute is putting all of our work on the web, right? And that has created a wonderful avenue for people to get what they need when they need it, and at no cost and all of that sort of thing. And a lot of the traffic that has come to our websites and to the social media pages and is all clergy, right, or the lay people in those congregations. So that's one way. But we've also realized that there, especially with the EPIC project, right, we are trying a whole host of ways to make those connections with existing networks that already exist, whether they be Lilly-funded initiatives or Gammon Seminary or other collections of congregations and pastors where we can come and do presentations and make our material available. So we're trying, I mean, in some sense, the web has been a passive way to put that up and make it available in a more popular fashion. But we're also trying now to find ways to push some of that out, and we're pushing ourselves too. More video, more podcasts, more blog posts, all of those kinds of things. So that's we went to a communications conference just this past week, and much of what Sarah Brown was presenting about was where are our growing edges on how do we push this out in new and different ways for the changing world as it is. And so it is something that we're constantly asking ourselves in the team that we have assembled now. It's a different world than it was 25 years ago when I came as a postdoc, but we want to keep growing. Yeah, let me get David in then. And
how
I would just like to reinforce and support what you're saying, because one of the things, both as a sociologist and as a minister, that is special about an African American audience is that African Americans in general will read. African Americans want to solve the problems that they face. And so they will go out and buy books by scholars and struggle through books by scholars, even if they don't have the level of education for which the book may be pitched. To give you and in all fields. I remember one time I was preaching one Sunday morning, and it was right after one of Murray's books had come out that basically was going on about race and IQ, and I said something, it wasn't in my manuscript, but I said it in the middle of the sermon about what was wrong with this book coming out and one of my deacons, who was from Bogalusa, Louisiana, rural Bogalusa, Louisiana, came up to me. He says, "Doc, I am so glad that you told me I was not born to be stupid." And he said, "And when you preach, I expect to learn something." So that need to learn and the demand for it comes from all levels of the congregation. And so, which is another reason why these data matter so much.
Well, that's a great way to stop. Oh, Candace, no, I'll let you have the last word.
It's fine. I'm Candace Lewis, and I'm a theological seminary at the ITC. And I'm honored to be here. Now, this is really my first time in this space, and the way I came to the Hartford Institute was out of curiosity. So I think what I add to the conversation today is that definitely the digital age really opens up a whole new world for research, and results or their demographics showing up in the survey. So, and then the opportunity is, and then so then what? In this particular case, the Lilly Foundation offered a grant, offering resources to the people who have been impacted by the pandemic. So there's, in this particular case, there's a direct return to the people that are being asked, what they think and how they've been impacted. And people aren't always looking for a direct result, but with the promise that we're going to share what you think about the topic, we're finding a real openness to complete survey.
Well, that really points to our future and where we're going. So thank you, Ken. I want you to join me thanking these panelists. And now I'd like to invite President Lord to come and say a few words, and then we will have some cake and end the day. But also, if anyone is staying over for the evening dinner, we are going to have the Institute open from 4 to 6, and you're welcome to gather in that space and sit and check your email or whatever you want to do. But that's a place to sort of relax and rest and recoup.
Thank you, Scott. My name is Joel Lohr. I'm president here at Hartford International University. I'm truly honored to be here and to celebrate with all of you and to be part of this. And when people ask me, what's Hartford like? I'm from Canada, by the way, so I'm kind of a long way from home. And I always respond, well, I usually say two things. Hartford is a city in the middle of a forest, and it really feels that way to me, but it's also an in-between space. It's kind of in between Boston, New York, and I think that has shaped its identity in really important ways. And that in-between space has created change and innovation here in ways that I think is unusual, especially for a small place. I mean, why was it that in 1889 a woman could not go to seminary anywhere in the country but right here in Hartford? Like, what was it about this place? Or that we started the Center for Muslim-Christian Relations so early on with Duncan MacDonald, and then later in 1973 with the MacDonald Center. And I bring this up not because I have to pitch, Hartford International, which is my job, but I think it connects to the Hartford Institute for Religion Research. As I listened to the sessions, and I apologize, I couldn't be here this morning, accreditation, I was in Boston, but as I listened this afternoon, I thought this is an in-between place. We have the wrestling between the quantitative research and the qualitative research. Fundamentally important. This is not just the dry kind of, we're going to publish data. We're going to look at qualitative analysis as well and make this, and it matters. And I think that's my second point. It's both dispassionate in its sort of data, and it's passionate because it cares. I mean, Scott Thumma is showing up at your church, gay in religion, and he cares about what this data can do for the church, right? I mean, this matters. It's dispassionate in its, kind of to your point, what was it? The unchecked theological imagination. Like, this is what's happening. It's like, nah, not actually, if you look at the data. So it has both of this in between, the dispassionate and the passionate. And then if you look at the people who have been here, I just want to comment on the people I've gotten to know. I deeply regret that we didn't get a chance to spend time with Jackson Carroll today, who I think you heard was here in Hartford, but eventually had to leave for his wife's illness. But the people who I've gotten to know, Dave Rusin, of course, Scott Thumma, I work with him, Bill McKinney, now getting to know Nancy Ammerman and knowing their work by stature. If you go way back to people like Peter Berger, if you haven't read Peter Berger, you got to read Peter Berger. I was reading some of him last night. There's this balance of the rigorous academic discipline that goes on here with the sort of caring about the people in the pew that I don't always see everywhere at universities. And so I just want to commend 40 years, which I think actually is not just 40 years, and I think we'll hear a bit more about that tonight at our dinner from our keynote. It goes back much further than 40 years, but I think this is a truly amazing moment. I'm honored that this is the home here at Hartford International, formerly Hartford Seminary. Scott, I just want to personally commend you for the good work you've done to make today happen, but especially the last, what's it been, 2000, what year did you start?
It's 25 years.
25 years total, but as director. So Scott has a huge hand in all this. Thank you. But to the past directors, Rusin, all of you, Ammerman, Jackson, Carol, thank you so much for what you've brought to this place. I am in a moment of celebration. We're going to cut some cake. How does that happen, Scott? And we with a knife. We have a knife back there. We will have our cake. We will eat it as well as was just set up here. Thank you, Cheryl. Congratulations. Please join me in one more time celebrating by our applause. Congratulations, and thank you for everything you've done today.
So, yes, have some cake. Thank you.